part 8 of the Mountain House Saga. It's only part 2 of the utility room adventure. Click on the card to see part 1. The ceiling is done, the lights are done, including removing one broken fixture. Got it. It's time to get these doors figured out. Like I said last time, there are a lot of options for rolling barn door kits, and none of them are cheap. I came up with a lot of different ideas for designing my own rail system, but considering we were hanging 4 doors on 20 feet of 2 rails, I decided to leave the metalwork to the experts. And just about everything we're doing with this project is backwards from a normal barn door project. As in, we are starting out with a custom beam to hang the rails on, and we won't even know how tall the doors need to be until we're 3/4 of the way through. I found a 2-rail bypass system on wayfair.com that was sort of affordable. 2 120-inch rail systems for 400 bucks. I built my support beam out of 2 10-foot 2x12s, and then I used a piece of the rail system and a jig to pre-drill as many of the holes as I could. Now what's a jig? A jig is anything that you cobble together to make sure that a repeatable process ends up with consistent results. That little piece of 2x6 with the holes drilled in it made sure that all of my holes were the same. And when I say all the holes, holy cow, all the holes. 3 holes and 6 bolts per bracket for 15 brackets. This was going to be a very repetitive job. But finally the rails were up and it was time to start building the doors. Except no. Because first we wanted to paint the utility part of the utility room. All of those pipes. And we had to replace the nasty ugly wall that we took out because it was in the way of our beam. Have I mentioned that nothing in this house is square? There was a crooked man who had a crooked house. And now to build the doors. Except no. Because first, what kind of doors? So many design options. There are a bunch of YouTube videos about building your own barn doors, and most of them are using common boards, just regular old square boards, but I was worried about them joining straight with no gaps and no warping. And you know I love me some shiplap, but this called for something that actually locked together. So we went with pine tongue and groove boards. Bonus tip, be picky about your lumber. Especially if you're shopping at a big box store, the quality of their lumber is awful. Most of the boards are warped or twisted or split, or they have live edges or too many knots. Even if you have to ask the guy in the vest if they have more on a pallet in the back. Don't be afraid to ask. So we finally picked our design and we had all of our lumber. To be fair, $200 of that was for some fancy floor epoxy. We'll come back to that later. Pro tip number 2, think about how you're getting the lumber home. Make sure that it's really secure. There's no sense spending an hour picking out the perfect boards only to have them shuffle around on the way home and crack and break the ends off. And these giant twist tie things are awesome. Now I could finally start making some doors. I made a jig to cut all the tongue and groove to the same length. Pro tip number 3, never trust that the ends of your lumber are cut good and square. Cut both ends to be sure. We put a bead of glue in the grooves and we clamped it all together. Yes, I had to buy 2 60-inch clamps just for this job. Naturally, we don't want the edges of our doors to be either tongue or groove, and we knew that we would be trimming the doors down to size anyway. The trick here is to use a straight board as a guide for your saw, and make sure you keep the saw level without losing any fingers. Then it was time for the support boards. These are not just for looks. They give the door extra strength and they keep the tongue and groove boards straight. I could have done a bunch of math to measure out these things exactly right, but I find that it's a lot easier just to measure it in place. And if there's any doubt, you can cut them a little bit long and trim them back to fit exact. Once all the pieces were cut, everything got a couple of coats of polyurethane, and then we nailed everything together. I got the rollers attached, making sure that they were good and straight, and we had our first door!
Am I on?
No. Now down. I had to make one of the doors with a special notch to fit around the soffit. That's the technical name for that box that I built to go around those stupid pipes. And then it was just rinse and repeat. Eventually, we had us some barn doors. Now to do something about that horrible floor. You know that this is a crooked house, but that concrete floor was as crooked as they come. you can get seasick just walking across it. That means that tile and wood and things like that are just not gonna work, so we decided to just paint it. We spent way too much on this fancy garage floor epoxy so that it would be number one, really tough, no scratches, no peeling. And number two, glitter! Now the instructions for this stuff talked all about the harsh chemicals that you have to use and to make sure that you hose off your garage floor really well. This is a basement. There will be no hosing floors. So naturally I took to YouTube to see how this was really gonna work. And it turns out that this super expensive, super fancy, super strong epoxy is super disappointing.
If I had one complaint about the product after installation, I'd say that it just scratched maybe a little bit easier than I would have hoped for.
One last word about the epoxy. It came up wherever my wife parked, where she parked, the epoxy came up.
But if you look at my other room, which I actually use as a garage, I mean, this floor is completely destroyed.
Thankfully we hadn't opened anything, so we just returned it, and we spent less than half as much on some garage paint, some clear coat, and of course, glitter! The first coat looked pretty bad. The second coat looked great. The glitter and the clear coat didn't really work, so we painted over it with another coat of the garage paint, and we're pleased to find out that the glitter actually showed through. It worked after all. Now finally, the room was completely done, and it looks amazing. The doors perfectly match the rest of our raw pine look, the red floor really pops, and if, nay when, we have to do some plumbing or work on the boiler, the doors completely roll out of the way. I was surprised at how much of a gap there is between the doors, so if you're planning on doing one of these trendy barn door kits on your half bath or something, you better hope that your guests aren't shy. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end. I promise the Mountain House Saga will continue. Subscribe so that you don't miss it.